So hello everyone, this is a Jupyter IPython dev meeting for Tuesday, July 25th, 2017. Let's see what news today. I'm the first one, so I'm going to go ahead. Nothing much on IPython. Mostly needing time to review some people's PR. I would really appreciate helps. There have been a couple of PRs waiting for a month, not from me, and I would like to move them forward. I'm busy with other stuff. And I've mostly closed a lot of old issue because we were above 1K issue open, and I closed a lot of issues that were not relevant anymore, and now we're around 900. I would like to make it decrease the number of issue further, so that it's not a daunting task to find an issue to work on when you want to fix something on IPython. But for IPython, that's about it for this week. So next we have M. Do you have anything to say on NBConvert?
Sure. So there are a couple small things that were merged, and a few PRs that could use some look at. So in terms of things that were merged, updating MSTune because the requirement there, because people there in an old version of it, it wouldn't know how to parse raw HTML if it didn't have all the attributes quoted. Lots of people don't quote things like with, which since it's a number, they don't think of it as quoting. But that's fixed with the more recent version, so requiring that. Getting a traitlet for specifying the browser in the serve post processor, and a few other things. The things that I sort of want people to look at is putting all of the math jacks, and actually, Nick, I'd in particular like you to look at this. The switching all of the math jacks in NBConvert to just use the inline grammar, because we can very easily, and already had kind of been doing that. And the way that MSTune handles new lines and what it decides is an HTML block is actually pretty messy and doesn't quite adhere to common mark or anything. It's sort of one of the more hacked together pieces of MSTune is what is determined to be the end of, say, a block. So whereas the way we've defined everything makes it fairly like, if you can think of any test cases that would break the logic, I'd love to see those. Feel free to jump in if you have thoughts. I will take the silences.
So we want to go and troll back through some of the obviously our best test cases come from NBViewer, old NBViewer issues where there was crazy because people
That's what started this whole journey.
Yeah. Well, that's hooray for testing on the thousands. The unawareness of crowds. Yes.
Many of those will not be fixed by this, and there are some things that even if we fix it, it won't be fixed. Having to do especially with raw HTML. This is just the MathJax one, and there haven't been as many issues about that directly.
Certainly some. I will take a swing at that when I have the opportunity to do so, and try and find some breaking test cases.
Awesome. I will put a link to it in the document so that you know which PR I'm talking about, although the name of it probably makes sense. Other things still, this I guess fits more with a notebook, but this kind of is more of an NBConvert issue because of the way that we're using this stuff. I have a PR on Notebook right now that allows you to use labels on equations. Previously, if you did this, they would break, because the notion of a label is equivalent to an ID in the DOM from the perspective of MathJax, and every time we re-rendered an equation, it would re-add it to the DOM. And so then there would be two elements that have the same ID, and MathJax is like, that is nonsense, don't do that. And so instead, now if we just wiped all of the IDs, you can re-render a thing. This might mess up some of the extensions that are like relying on equation numbering, but also tested with how you would do this in order to make equation numbering feasible, and you end up with this really weird situation where if you are every time you open a notebook, if it has like more than one MathJax entity, if you have n MathJax entities, it seems to need to re-render, at least if you do it in a naive way, n minus 1 times, n choose 2 minus 1 times, and that is not fun, especially since you have the issue with MathJax like growing and shrinking and growing and shrinking each time it does that. Other than that, not too much this week. Been working a lot on some other testing stuff. And is there a spot for the Jupyter Markdown stuff later on in the document? I haven't actually looked too closely.
Just do it now.
Okay, I will just do it now. Been moving forward on giving us a roadmap for how to move forward on testing the Jupyter Markdown stuff. Trying to break it down into like specific pieces in the hopes that someone might join at Berkeley as a student or something, either for the end of the summer, but beginning of fall, like work together to sort of guide them through, because I think it's actually the kind of project that can teach someone a lot about, they don't need to know a lot about the notebook going into it, but will gain a lot about a lot of knowledge through the course of doing it. So, and yeah, so just trying to break that down. Happy to have comments, and especially if anyone has thoughts about how to, from within Python, get the call into the notebook JavaScript so that it would do a virtual DOM rendering, so we could get back the actual DOM HTML that users see, because that's what we actually want to test against. Not because we do funky things. We can't just rely on a call to marked. We can't just rely on a call to MathJax. Like, we really want to be using the notebook, like test the notebook markdown rendering natively somehow. But doing that entirely from within Python is a non-trivial task. So thoughts are very welcome.
Mike, we already have that working from within JavaScript, though.
Only if you want to look at it.
No. We have a programmatic test that compares the rendered output with the desired.
Oh, wait. I only saw that programmatic test is not called from the PyScript, correct?
No, it is. It's injected as a cell at the end of the notebook, so you have to run it in the front end. But it does what you're saying in JavaScript, though.
I prefer if we could do it entirely without having to run it in the front end. Like, that'd be my ideal set, because then we could just like have it on like CI and actually run this as a test and not need to like spawn up a virtual browser and then like try to extract it again from the like rendered version. So I will look at that to see if maybe that could be used as like a step forward in the right direction. But
you won't be able to do something without spawning a browser, because the browser has a rendering engine. So
yeah, you will have to spawn a browser. It's whether or not you can do that programmatically.
That's more what I meant. Sorry.
Yeah.
The new Chrome 59 headless capabilities that are still being, polished and everything like that would help a lot with this, probably.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'll look into that. Thank you all. That's about it for me.
Okay, I think I'm supposed to go next. So with regards to the demo, we now have the licensing information under control, and we did some powwowing about, or just like kind of conversing over the previous conversations we had about the previous presentation. So we were able to get notes from that, and those have now been turned into issues. And from there, we have this idea now of profiles. And these profiles are now going to be used for basically picking out what pieces of information that were used in a talk, and having them all in a single place, because we've noticed that there's been a pain point where people are having to navigate to relevant information for their talk. So we're going to have a profile that's a YAML file that takes everything and moves it into a particular place so that we all can have everything together. And then, let's see, any other pieces of information I should review? Let's see. Oh, Brian is saying Finder download disk. I think I guess we could discuss that for future reference. Do you want to talk about that, Brian?
Yeah, I can mention it briefly. So Fernando and I was just updating Fernando on the situation, the status of the Jupyter Lab demo, and the pattern that we're ending up using is that a given talk or demo ends up including resources from many different repositories. So it might include, a notebook from the IPy widgets. It might include Jake Vanderplas's notebooks. It might include, let's say a half dozen to a dozen different repos, different assets from those repos. And we don't want to get into having like dozens of submodules, Git submodules. That seems a little bit crazy. And so we actually have code that after you clone the repo, you run an invoke script that downloads what you need and puts it in a certain place. And we started to talk about the idea of having different profiles that use different version or different subsets of resources from the many repos. It puts it into a binder, and basically this brings up the question of, and this pattern also comes up in teaching a lot. When I'm teaching, I may have my own notebooks, but then I'm also pulling from a few other repositories, and not the whole repository. It really is like one notebook from another repo or something. And so the question is, does Binder have, or could we enable Binder to have the ability to download assets that are not version controlled, but that can be included in the Binder build, so that we could start to make sort of assemblages of assets from all over, but still keep it reproducible. We don't want to sort of reversion control them, copy them into a repo. I don't know. So that question came up as it relates to Binder and our desire to have. Yeah.
You just create your own Docker image, and in the Docker image you can do whatever you like, and then your Binder is a Docker image. That's what I see is a best answer. We can't, especially because Binder is not aware of what it is running, you can't start to get conventions, or difficult. It's really start to be difficult to have convention for that.
I mean, could we have a YAML file of that simply lists assets to download, or?
Well, it's complicated because it will need two steps, because the information Binder has is basically the URL it builds things once. Can try to do something like that, but it's basically reinventing the wheel, reinventing version control, especially if you say that assets are not version controlled. How do you ensure that this YAML file will get the same version of the assets if they've changed?
Yeah, we are targeting particular tags to make sure that we get the actual versions we want of things. But
yeah, then from Binder's perspective, too, doing that in a Docker file makes sense.
Okay.
So just to make sure, by profile, it meant it's a YAML file for Jupyter Lab that set up a specific layout.
No. An example would be, a generic Jupyter Lab demo might cover, we want to open some CSV files. So we've found a couple CSV files from different repositories, but a Jupyter Lab demo focused on IPy widgets may want one of those CSV files, but all of the IPyWidget demo notebooks. A demo of Jupyter Lab for a bioinformatics audience may not need the IPyWidgets notebooks, but may want to get the like a lot of the introduction to applied bioinformatics from Greg Caparasso's group. It's what we're finding is the idea of doing a demo for Jupyter Lab is a thing, but under that subheading, there's many different variants, and you could imagine one version of those being here's the profile you use at your meetup to do an introduction to the Jupyter Notebook in Jupyter Lab with a focus on data science. And so for that, you've got all the notebook from Jake Vanderplas's Python Data Science Handbook. But each of these things includes assets from multiple repos, and they overlap. Like there's a lot of overlap actually between the different profiles. So it's a weird, like and I've found this in my university teaching as well, that the idealized world of having, hey, everything I'm using for this course is in a GitHub repository, just doesn't work. Like I pull resources and data sets, and I'm often faced with this choice myself, that I either have scripts that copy them, or I have to do Git submodules, or I have to version control them again. It's one of the more painful parts of sort of real life teaching and demos and talks, and
Hey, Brian.
But go ahead, Carol.
Oh, I was going to say, I mean, a lot of these issues sound very similar to like software carpentry and how they craft a workshop. And so it probably makes sense to go back and look at that stuff. And like Min said, for Binder, as long as you can tie it to a Docker file and a particular commit, it's not a problem to launch that. And even what Jessica and folks have already done, like with the PyInvoke, like I tried it the other day and it worked really well. So, even if Binder isn't part of the direct equation, just getting to the place where somebody can have a Docker file that they can have in their repo, and might be another way to go forward with it. So I would say let's look at software carpentry and see if we can get some good ideas from there.
Is it possible to have multiple Docker files in a single repo? Or do we need to use branches?
Not yet, but that's easy to add.
Okay.
One of the things we've talked about with the Binder spec is, do you get to, so at the first level, you can specify the environment requirements are a Docker file, a content environment file, or a pip requirements file. And the second level of that is that you get to specify where that file is.
Okay. So it's,
and that I think is currently missing, but isn't hard to add.
So if these profiles were Docker files, that might be a doable thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you only really need the Docker files. So you only really need the Docker files for things that should be fetched kind of before starting the server. Or before the user does things, because if the user's launching into a notebook or into an environment where they can run code, so this is what I've done with the LIGO notebook, which has data files it depends on that can be fetched, is basically the first code that executes fetches those resources. But that only works if you're starting in that context. But if you need to modify Jupyter Lab or something like that, then it doesn't work.
Yeah, that might work for some of us for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that I think is the simplest one, because then you can just have a requirements.txt. And then everybody who runs through the code will get everything they need, no matter what context they're in. So that's kind of the trade-off.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that gives us some ideas. Thanks. but yeah, Carol, we're really thinking about the idea of having the set of prepackaged materials that we could offer to meetups.
I think that's great.
As binders. That's the big
that would
vision.
be awesome. And Jessica and I had talked before the call a little bit about spending some time on it at JupyterCon too. So when in person. So yeah, I think it's great.
Awesome.
Okay, let's move to the next section. Jupyter Lab. Steve or Darian, are you on the call?
Here. We released 0.26 last week, which included the backend handling of user settings. So now you can actually edit them on disk and they're persisted, not just in the client side. Also, the file types are handled uniformly now, where we were sort of ad hoc handling icons in different places in the application. Now it's all consolidated, uniform. MIME render extensions can provide file types that include their icons, things like that. So everything's a lot more streamlined and consolidated around those file types. We're still working on the refactor notebook models and views. We're close to having a hybrid of the original observable pattern, bringing in the Redux pattern on top of that. So a fusion of the two ideas. We're close to having a working model of that. We have a new FASTA extension that Jason added at the SciPy conference, which allows you to view bio files, FASTA type files. So a new MIME renderer as part of the repos in Jupyter Lab.
It's really cool too.
Yes, and Cameron overhauled the dark theme, so now we have sort of feature parity between the light and dark themes in Jupyter Lab. And that's it.
Notebook format. Brian, you have nothing written. Do you want to say anything?
Yes. So I talked to Kyle last week. We had this pull request on adding the new, what did we end up calling it? Source hidden and output hidden metadata. And this is a pull request Kyle submitted after the in-person team meeting in the spring. It had basically stalled on bigger questions about where should we put metadata in the notebook. And basically we felt like these two particular metadata fields were sort of a roadblock for us with Jupyter Lab and Interact. And so we've gone ahead and merged that. I think it properly has refocused us on the larger questions of how we handle metadata in the notebook. And Kyle has some really good ideas about ways that we can resolve this sort of the awkwardness we have of the per cell metadata that we're telling every third parties that they can use freely, but then we're trying to use it as well. And there's just awkwardness there. And I think we should open a set of other issues. And we may, at some point here, we may be looking at another major notebook format version bump. And so, this may intersect, the bigger picture of this may intersect also with the work on standardizing our Markdown syntax. But we felt like let's not wait on these bigger discussions because we really need to start using those the source and output hidden metadata field. So that's where we're at with that.
That's allowing people to put arbitrary metadata isn't unique to the cells, right? It's everywhere. We say that they can use any metadata anywhere. It's just they should be careful about namespacing and being specific about their own stuff, right? Like that is sort of, that's what, when I look at the docs right now, that's what I'm seeing. And that's what I thought, like, and then even more the conversation involved the tags in particular, we are thinking of as primarily user focused and not something that we wanted to mess around in. Is that accurate?
And basically, Kyle's idea was if there's things like this that are, we're sort of saying every front end needs to know how to handle these things. At that point, it sort of needs to be moved to top level cell data, not metadata, like even above the metadata. And that's Kyle's most recent proposal. And that's how we originally did handle these things. So like the collapsed field is not in the metadata. And so that's Kyle's recent idea, basically. Let's move our own stuff out of metadata and then tell people to go crazy.
But with something like hidden or visibility and collapse, is that something we really want stored as part of the cell state? What if you have multiple people working on a notebook? Like those users are going to want individual, separate, collapsed, expanded, visible, hidden state. And so I can see an argument being made for having this in metadata, so that something like, okay, MB format or rise or something like that, or MB convert, when they're rendering a static version of the notebook, they can take into account whether the user had their particular thing shown or hidden. But to say that the UIs should respect that, or that somehow is something that needs to be applied to every front end, might be causing us more pain in the future than otherwise.
Yeah. So our thought is, at least for Jupyter Lab, is exactly along those lines, where we will have view state that's not persisted to the notebook document by default. And then there'd be some sort of separate step, like a menu item that says persist current, view state to notebook document. So there'd be a deliberate action if the user got their notebook into a state and said, all right, this is the notebook that I want NB convert to C. But yes, in a real-time collaboration context, I don't think this state would be shared between users.
Well, I mean, but if somebody commits it to the document, then it would be shared with users. So are we just saying that like Jupyter Lab is going to ignore those?
You could interpret it as initial state rather than, you have to make this state. So take that as your initial value, and if the view's already been created and it's changed, you can ignore it.
Yeah, and the usage case there is that sometimes you want to open up a notebook and have it open up in a mode that is suitable for presenting to an audience that doesn't want to look at the code or only wants to look at these parts of the cells. And so I do think being able to load a notebook and see that state that was in the notebook document, but it should be a deliberate thing where someone working on that notebook says, all right, here's the official state that I want to preserve as, and the collaborators on the notebook would discuss and say, yes, that looks good, and then it's saved.
I guess I'm just wondering, because now we're having this conversation where all these subtle implicit rules revolve around how the front end should handle this state, where it sounds like maybe what we actually want is different levels or different explicit properties that say, okay, when you render this in output, like this should be a hidden cell. So maybe it's like generated output hidden cell or something like that. Like you have different levels of visibility that are specifying the intent behind the visibility, rather than having one single visibility flag and then inferring the intent based on where that particular bit of data is being used.
So
yeah.
At least what I thought the model that we were going to go forward with NB-convert, and this is how I've been trying to figure out how to design all this, is people need the thing that is going to be surfaced in NB-convert is not something that is like Jupyter specific, but rather people can assign a bunch of tags and then they can filter on those tags. Like,
can we move this discussion outside of just a weekly summary, because it seems like a lot of people have feedback and it might be nice to write that up, put that in an issue, and rediscuss.
Yeah, that's yeah, I think we can do that. How about we open an issue on Jupyter Lab? It's as good as any place because it's a lot of front-end questions about this.
Please post a link in the notes here.
Okay.
Thank you, Jason. Jupyter widgets, Jason, it's your turn.
So IPyWidget 7.0 beta 2 was released. We think this is fairly close to release. Testing a bunch of notebooks, and then there's a few documentation things that we're taking care of, and a UI review. Please try it out if you have time. We hope to cut a release candidate in the next week, and then wait a few more days before a final release. And so now's the time to really see any issues before we release 7.0. We also had a great tutorial at SciPy, put a link in the notes, and we had 2 people that worked on Jupyter widgets during the sprint to help with the UI, some of the UI issues.
Okay, now it's services. Peter, do you have anything? Are you on the call? Otherwise, I would just, yes, you are.
I put a couple notes there. I think I mentioned 2 weeks back that we're moving the Docker stacks, Docker builds to DrCloud, and they've been building smoothly since that transition. So that's a good thing, automated builds. Min did some work right after the meeting, again, 2 weeks ago when I mentioned that someone had requested an MViewer Python package on PyPy, and Min, I'm sorry, I totally forgot to go and test that. So I merged what was there, and hopefully I'll get back to testing it, but let me walk you when I get to PyPy if you want. We'll find out from users if it doesn't work, right? Yeah. And I noticed there's been a steady trickle, not over the past couple of weeks, but past couple of months, about issues against TempMB. And that just got me thinking that the Docker image that's used on TempMB is pretty old. We haven't updated in a long time. And maybe when Notebook 5.1, that release comes out, or some release, we should, take the plunge and update it if we're going to continue to maintain TempMB. I guess that ties back into binder conversations and whatnot. But the TempMB Try Jupyter is sort of take your first look at Jupyter. Probably behooves us to make sure it's reasonably up to date. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Next we have Jupyter Hub. Min and Carol, do you want to summarize what has been happening recently?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of activity on scaling Jupyter Hub suddenly, thanks to some things going on at Berkeley. And UV's doing a lot of work on that, and we're finding various places we can get more room to get at least several thousand users per hub all logging in at the same time. And that's going reasonably well. And there's some more work that I believe Matthias and Em are working on and Chris all at Berkeley on dealing with the scaling and understanding the numbers that are coming out of UV scaling tests and building good ways to figure out actually what our capacity is, which is something that people have been asking for a long time.
Originally, UV wanted to create a hub and call it a hub, and I said, no, there is enough hub.
Yeah, we talked about the hub. Yeah.
But at least don't call it hub.
Yeah. And so I think the idea is to do something very similar to what Quantopian's been doing for a while, deterministically routing users to hub instances. And then the scaling work is largely figuring out how many users you can fit on a given hub instance. And Carol's submitted a few PRs this week on restructuring a lot of the documentation and making it much nicer. So thanks, Carol, for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Next is conferences and workshop. I'm going to go through that because I'm guessing it's not one in particular. Next conference is PyBay in San Francisco, August 11 to 13. I will be at PyBay. If you want to come and talk to me about Jupyter, I'll be around. I'll be happy if someone else from the Jupyter team is there. I don't know if Carol will be there or if Brian will be there. No one. well, it's probably still tickets available if someone else wants to join. Then we have PyCon Poland, August 17th to 20. I don't know if one of us is there. Then we have missing here, we have JupyterCon that you should come to in August in New York. A lot of fun stuff to do there. We have plenty of blog posts and announcements here and there. Please come and see us. Then you have Strata, New York City, late September. ODSC West, beginning of November. I'm submitting a talk. I'm waiting for an answer. We might still be there even if there is no talk accepted. PlotCon New York. Carol is asking if anyone is attending supercomputing later this year. If so, submit a Jupyter buff by end of this month. And Science Gateway webinar went well. Carol, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a general overview of the classic notebook, Jupyter Hub and Jupyter Lab, and all the materials are in that repo. The link that I dropped in is actually just a resource page, which has a lot of good links to recent talks and things that have been going on. But the feedback was very positive, and it was really nice to use the template that the Cal Poly folks put together, because it made it easier to mix and match content. And the Jupyter Lab section towards the end is sort of like virtual JSON in slides from his lightning talk. So and then I linked in the materials, like, so that folks could watch the lightning talk itself. So so it worked out really well, and I really like that the same look and feel of everything made it really easy to put content together. And at some point the video will get posted too, but for now you've got everything. The keynote files are in there, so if anybody wants to remix that, go for it.
Thank you. So next section is JupyterCon, in a little under 30 days away. Book your flights. We'll have a Jupyter and UserFocused booth at the conference. And don't forget about the sprint on Saturday, 9 to 5 at the conference hotel. Yeah, please email Kyle or Jason if you like to be sprint leader for a particular project. And please register with Eventbrite for us to know how many people are attending. And next we have legal and governance. Brian, you seem to be the one who wrote that.
Yeah, so we have now merged MIN's Trademark Policy in the governance repo. So this is a policy that we wrote. It's largely modeled after the Trademark Policy of Python itself, adapted to our project. And so everyone can now consult that in terms of usage of the Jupyter trademarks. I should also mention, at this point, we now do have the formal trademarks for Jupyter, both the word mark and the logo. And so I think we'll have to look back. I think the current trademark policy reflects that those were in process at the time. So we probably need to make a change to reflect that we actually have those trademarks. And then in other fun, the Apache Foundation recently completely banned the usage of React.js and other projects with the Facebook license. And this is a global ban for any Apache Foundation project. The RocksDB project responded by changing their license. So RocksDB is one of these Facebook projects. And that sort of opened up the immediate floodgate of questions of, okay, well, why can't React change their license? And so there's an issue there where there's an ongoing discussion. You're welcome to read the issue. It sounds like the Facebook team, the legal team, and the software engineers are thinking about this, evaluating it. I think it's important to note that we previously have discussed these questions with our lawyer, and the rough conclusion of the lawyer is that there probably is not an actual problem with the license, but what the thing that we keep running into is that the license is sufficiently vague that even though there may not be a problem with it, it's causing a lot of people a lot of pain in terms of adopting React-based software. And so I think it's one of those things at this point where there's not likely a problem with it, but we're still running into it regardless. It's one of those things that our legal system is not based on whether or not things are problems or not problems, or legal or not legal, but merely on the fact whether or not lawyers have to get involved. And I think this is one of those things where it's sufficiently vague that legal teams at companies are still worrying about this. At this point, we ourselves, and this is the broad Jupyter Lab notebook team, really would like to use Jupyter Lab in core FOSS for Jupyter Lab itself. We are already using React.js in some lab extensions that are not part of the main code base. But I at least wanted to update everyone on sort of what we're hearing. Best case scenario, they relicense it and all this goes away. And so we're hoping that it turns out that way.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think now the next topic is team meeting. It's in Bloomberg in New York, but I don't think we need to discuss that online. And it's August 28th and 29th. And next is action item for this week. If you're part of the team and you have received an email about shirts, please respond as soon as possible. Hotel rooms for JupyterCon, please reply again. And you should have received a Google Calendar invite. Please reply. M could need some review on NB-convert and has a link to pull request 611. And Thomas has list, yes, and Thomas says we're trying to get notebook 5.1 out through the door, so please give us some help and check things. Release for this week, the authenticator for Jupyter Hub has been released in version 0.6, and to be released soon, we will have notebook 5.1, Jupyter Hub 08, and Jupyter Widget 7. Please install the preview release RC and beta with --pray with pip. It's been almost 50 minutes, so thank you everyone. Someone have something to add? No, nobody. So see you next week. Thank you very much and have a nice week.
Bye, Internet.
Bye.